Hi, everyone. It's time, I think. So we're going to start. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you to the Center for Jewish History, Center for Jewish Studies. That was for Ethan, and yeah, it was a special dedication. And the Department of Comparative Literature for co-sponsoring the event. And particularly thank you to Etta and Jennifer for all the work in bringing it together. I want to say just a few words on what we're going to do. So Naomi is going to speak, I think, generally about the book, show us some interesting artifacts, and then speak specifically about one of the chapters from which the title for this evening is taken, Psychoanalysis for Diabetics. And then Yael Segalovitz, right here, is going to say a few words and ending with some questions, and I'll add some questions, and we'll open it for questions from everyone. And before we go there, I would like to introduce Naomi Seidman. So Naomi Seidman is the Chancellor Jackman Professor in the Arts in the departments of the Study of the Religion and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, and we're very lucky that she's here and willing to do this event. She's the winner of many awards, including, among others, the National Jewish Book Award, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and most recently a Signal Award. Professor Seidman's work has been shaping the various fields in which she works. Translating the Jewish Freud, this beautiful book, is her fifth book, and although each of its predecessors pursues a new and different area or archive or theoretical question, in one way, they all do exactly the same thing, and that is that each of her books has been field-defining, compelling us to contend with ever more daring, ever more playful, ever more rigorous arguments, conceptualizations, and effective attitudes to our various objects of study. And I'd like to just say a few words about those books. So her first book, A Marriage Made in Heaven, which follows from a dissertation written here in this very building. So A Marriage Made in Heaven forced scholars of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures to come up with a new understanding of gender and sexuality, not only thematically, but in the ways that the two were theorized, litigated, or desired within those literatures. Her second book, Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation, offered a seminal intervention in the field of translation studies by weaving a transtemporal narrative and analysis of the theological polemics that have fed and defined translation theory in the West throughout the centuries. In her third book, The Marriage Plot, subtitled Or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature, she picked up where A Marriage Made in Heaven left off, providing us with a new understanding of Jewish literary modernity under the sign or practices of gender, sexuality, romance, and the history of emotions. Professor Seidman's fourth book, Sarah Schneer and the Beis Yaakov Movement, Revolution in the Name of Tradition, deals with the history of the movement for Jewish Orthodox women's education, of which we're both victims or beneficiaries, depending on your perspective. This book, too, has charted innovative prospects methodologically, theoretically, and in its public-facing qualities for the study of Orthodox or traditional Jews and in the study of gender and the modern Jewish experience. I'll not expand on her fifth book because this is what we're going to be hearing about today, and we're celebrating its recent publication. But having already had the opportunity to read and discuss it with graduate students in the graduate seminar here in the fall, I can say that it clearly joins her previous work in its ability to redirect and foundationally reconfigure the conversation. So without spoilers or further ado, please join me in welcoming Naomi Seidman.
Do I take that? No. Hi. Thank you. Wow, thank you. And thank you also to the people who have already been thanked, and maybe some more, but Etta and Jennifer and I forget your names, the people doing all that stuff over there. And of course to Roni and to Yael, it's been, you didn't say I was on your dissertation committee. Well, it was a secret. It was a really amazing dissertation. I think I'm just going to talk about your dissertation. No, I'll talk about my book. So thank you all for coming. This is really exciting. And as Roni said, there's a lot of my life that took place in this building for more years than I really care to think about. I used to say I was a graduate student. And I was a graduate student here. So I'm just going to try to give you a feeling for how this book came to be by showing you basically these books I started collecting. The book that I wrote started as me just finding these books and trying to figure out what to do with them. And I'll just show them to you. We'll start with this one. I'll just go like that. And here's the first edition of the first book of Freud to be translated into Yiddish. It's from 1928. And I love these books for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with what they say. This one I love because it's a library book. And it came from a Yiddish socialist library in Toronto that went out of business, as Yiddish socialist libraries tend to. The last time it was due was February 19th, 1948. Now I own it. I actually collected so many of these books that I had doubles and triples of a few of them, and I donated them to the Freud Museum a few months ago, the extras. But this is psychopathology. This is group psychology and the individual ego in Yiddish, which published in 1928, the same year that the first Hebrew translation of Freud was published, also group psychology and the individual ego. Let's see, what can I say about this? This is actually not a translation of Freud. They're all falling apart, though the last time I did this, there was a bookbinder in the audience who helped me. So some of them, as you can see, have been not very professionally held together for the next time I do this. I've been schlepping these books around. So this one, oh boy, I shouldn't even open it. This is 1935, Max Weinreich, Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, which is basically a psychoanalysis of, you like it? It's an amazing book. It's shocking to me that people don't know about it. It's basically a psychoanalysis of Jewishness. It's an attempt to discover what Jewishness is, using Freud as a major theorist, but also race theory. Max Weinreich, it's by Max Weinreich, Freud's authorized Yiddish translator. And he spent the winter of 1933, 1934. He spent the year at Yale in a seminar on personality and culture that was supposed to figure out, to basically apply psychoanalysis to cultures and see what's culturally distinct about various cultures. He was one of the two representatives of Poland, the other one not being a Jew. And he spent the winter break at the Tuskegee Institute talking to race scientists. And that's the other mode of understanding Jewishness that he took, is using insights from the Tuskegee Institute's race scholars and other places, Fisk University. This is Tarat Freud. And this was not actually published during Freud's lifetime, which is true of many of these books. But this one one of the reasons I like it is because there's actually an image on the cover, but also it's the way in which psychoanalysis was often described in the 20s and the 30s as the Torah of Freud. So that just caught my attention. I mean, the theory, a little bit like you can be translated as Freudianism, which is another way in which Freud was called. But when you say it in Hebrew, it has a particular kind of interest, to me anyway. And this one, Sigmund Freud, Psychopathologia shel Chayei Yom Yom, the psychopathology of everyday life. I have another copy of this, but I took this one because it's smaller. And one of the things I love about, there's all these things I love about these books, I'll just tell you. One of them is that there's a section in the psychopathology of everyday life which is about breaking objects, which is a real issue in Freud's house. If you know anything about Freud's house, there's a lot of little objects to break. And he psychoanalyzed them. And in Hebrew, the way Tzvi Wisłowski, the Hebrew translator, talked about this, was as shvirat kelim, the breaking of the vessels, which some of you might know is a very technical, Kabbalistic term that describes the catastrophe that is the world around us. So, so this is a little bit relevant to our times. This actually is from 1957, but it gets into my greatest hits collection by virtue of being Yiddish and Spanish. And some of you probably know, actually, I bet everyone in this room knows one thing about psychoanalysis and Spanish, which is that Buenos Aires is the capital of, like, everybody's always, everybody, the taxi drivers, the elevator operators, the whatever, they've all been psychoanalyzed. Buenos Aires is the capital of psychoanalysis, and it just so happens, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I do my slideshow, but psychoanalysis in Yiddish is still carried out. There are 2 Yiddish-speaking and Yiddish-teaching psychoanalysts alive today. I've met them both on Zoom in Buenos Aires. So the last place in which, if anyone is interested in being psychoanalyzed in Spanish, then you can still make it happen in Buenos Aires. This is a Buenos Aires journal called Dafka. How do you translate Dafka? Fuck you, basically. And this is the Sigmund Freud issue. I'll move on to this. This is Pesher Chalomot, interpretation of dreams in Hebrew. Why do I love this one? Maybe I should lie down and think about it. This one is translated by the publishing house called Yavne. Freud, which is the birthplace of rabbinic Judaism. And Freud, when he left Vienna, and he said he felt as if he was like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai moving to Yavne to escape the besieged city of Jerusalem. And in some way, Freud's Hebrew translators imagined themselves as rescuing Freud by bringing him into the Hebrew language. So it was very appropriate that the interpretation of dreams was published by a publishing house called Yavne. I know that went by very quickly, so if you didn't quite get it, there's more to come. We'll just forget about it or read the book. So this is really the most important book in my collection. It's the one that finally made me realize I had a book that I could write about these books, other than just loving them and admiring them periodically. And this is Totem and Taboo, published in 1939, and it has all kinds of reasons for being special. Well, where do I start? So one thing that is kind of interest is that Freud actually communicated with the Hebrew translator. His name was Yehuda Devir Devosis. Throughout the 1930s, there's correspondence between them. And as a matter of fact, it was actually quite difficult to consult. Devir Devosis consulted with Freud, which, because Devir Devosis didn't have a phone, this being Jerusalem in the 1930s, involved him sending a letter to Freud and Freud writing back, and Devosis going to the cafe down the street at a certain specified time to talk about his translations issues. That's one kind of, I guess, interesting thing about it. The other interesting thing about it is that this is the only translation, well, Hebrew is the only language in which Freud wrote prefaces that were published that were then canonized in the Standard Edition. So in the Standard Edition, Freud's prefaces for 2 out of 3 of Devosis's translations are translated into English, and part of the great Standard Edition of Freud's works that are canonized. They're considered the most important and most direct statements that Freud made in public, published about his feelings about being Jewish. So Freud wrote, he always felt he needed to tell all his Jewish translators and interlocutors that he wasn't a believer, as if they were all going to be totally shocked and horrified. He had a little bit of a weird conception of who these people were, and maybe they would be disappointed to hear that he wasn't a nationalist and he didn't have any national feelings. his whole relationship to Hebrew was complicated by the fact that Hebrew University, which he was on the board of, rejected the notion of having a chair in psychoanalysis. That didn't happen in his own lifetime. So his feelings about Zionism, if we can call it that, were very personal and somewhat egotistic. He said, I don't have any national feelings, I don't believe in God, and yet I am so moved to see this book in print. People can only imagine what it is I feel to be holding this book in my hands. And this language that is coming to life. And this is a book that has no particular Jewish standpoint, but it shows that the Holy Tongue being revived today, how did he put it exactly? That science cannot be strange or foreign to the spirit of the new Jewish spirit, Ruach HaYahadut HaChadashah. That's what he wrote. And for his other preface, he says the last line is, despite the fact that I don't know Hebrew or Yiddish, something in me is Jewish, and it's the deepest part of who I am, and one day science will be able to figure out what that is. And the chuckle that I just heard from the room, I will admit that it sounded like science fiction to me too. On the other hand, here is Weinrath's book as evidence that science was trying to figure it out. So Freud says very specifically that he doesn't think this is a book that has any Jewish standpoint. Let's just say that the translator begged to differ, as we know from many of the notes. So here, I just chose the simplest example. This is what Freud calls the catechism of totemism. And totemism, not the Bible, not about Jews, right? This is, he says specifically, this is not about Jews, which Jews have a hard time hearing. Here's number 7 in the Catechism of Totemism. Shvatim v'yichidim notlim latzmam shem chayot, chayot hatotem. So totemic people, followers of the totemic religion, take totemic names for themselves. Here is the footnote by Devosis. Gur Aryeh Yehuda Yisachar Chamor Garam Yehidan Nachash Alei, etc., etc. And what he's doing, quoting without any kind of commentary, is sections in the Bible in which Israelites or Jews or whatever you want to call them take the names of animals, and in the blessings of Jacob, they're described as being like these animals. So he is more or less disagreeing with Freud when Freud says this has nothing to do with Jews. For the translator, it has everything to do with Jews. So another reason that this particular book became so important to me is that Freud took this book with him to Vienna, from Vienna to London. So when he went from Vienna to London, he left most of his books behind. He sold some, he gave others to friends, and he only took some, let's say, books he felt particularly attached to. And this is now in that famous room in the Freud Museum in London. There it is on the shelf. I think it might even be this particular edition. And Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi says it's obvious that Freud must have known Hebrew, or why would he take this book with him? Why would he? Obviously, he knows Hebrew, he's just pretending not to, which I think makes no sense. I mean, Freud says he feels, in the introduction, he says he feels very Jewish, but he's sorry he doesn't know this language. He can no longer, it's too late for him to know Hebrew well. And to me, this book, which I schlepped around the world without opening up. And I continued to schlep around everywhere. And Freud is schlepping it around too. I basically decided this has nothing to do with actually reading it or knowing Hebrew. Whatever you think about whether Totem and Taboo is actually about Jews, right? There's a certain kind of, let's say, trend in Freud studies where everything's about Jews, right? Freud seems to be writing about gender, but he's really writing about circumcision. Or, you know, the penis envy is actually a kind of cover for circumcision. I don't know if you've heard that particular theory. I'm not denying that, but there's also a way in which Freud's, so the attempt to say that everything in Freud is basically about being Jewish, I think there's a way around that. And the way around that is to say, let's just accept it when Freud says that totem and taboo is not about Jews. And let's also notice that when Freud says, and yet I was so moved to see the Hebrew translation of totem and taboo, and let's accept that that's deeply about something Jewish, and then let's figure out what that is. So that's basically what my book is. My book is about it's what I call a surface reading. In other words, you don't need to open this book to feel what I'm talking about, right? Like Freud schlepped it around, I schlepp it around. Languages don't necessarily function by what they say. They also function by what they are. They function by, you don't necessarily need to know them to have intense feelings about them. And my kind of diagnosis of the field was that all these Jewish studies professors were expressing these kinds of attempts to make Jewish connections with Freud that may or may not have been there. It doesn't really actually matter. Forget Freud. Let's look at the Jewish studies scholars. Let's look at me. Why was I schlepping this book around without opening it up? And why did I love these books? So that's what my book is about. And I'm going to run you through like one particular chapter. Do I still have time, or did I just waste all my time? Okay, so Psychoanalysis for Diabetics. This explains my psychoanalysis was a disease of assimilated Jews. Eastern European Jews made do with diabetes. So what was psychoanalysis for people who couldn't afford to be psychoanalyzed, who had very little, or who had just never bothered to be psychoanalyzed? Here I'm raising my own hand. No doubt I need it. And who nevertheless had an attachment to Freud. What was that about? And I really think this kind of attachment is worth analyzing in more cases than just the crazy Jewish obsession with Freud. So this is not to say that there were no diabetic Jews that sought psychoanalysis. There's the case of the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who came to see Freud as a neurologist. At least we think so. There's a whole debate between Joseph Burke in London. But so he was looking for a neurologist. Freud was also just a doctor, along with being a psychoanalyst and the discoverer of psychoanalysis. And so there's an interesting case of a Rebbe who seems to, if we can read the case study suspiciously, and who was directed to see one of Freud's early disciples who broke with him, one of the group that broke with him in 1905, I think it was, Wilhelm Stekel. And one theory I had is that the reason, Joe Burke says, how could someone that preeminent have come to Freud, and then Freud sends him to Stekel when he's Stekel's first patient? Why would he have done it? Well, one reason is that Stekel spent summers of his childhood in the Hasidic town of Boyan, and it's possible that Freud was just looking for somebody who can conduct psychoanalysis in Yiddish with him. So this is just one example of a perfectly religious Jew who seems to have been psychoanalyzed. Okay, so this is some of my material from the press, mostly in the 1930s, when obsession with Freud was at its height. And this is from the English language forward, the section that was directed to, it said to children of its readers, but I think also other people read them too. It's the Freudian lullaby contest. One good contest deserves another. The price of $15, count them, 15, will be paid for the cleverest Freudian lullaby for a Jewish baby. The contest is open to all poets and would-be poets, etc. Freud was, and Freud was, maybe we can gauge the level of the interest in Freud by the fact that they had 1,100 Freudian lullabies for Jewish babies were received from readers living in 36 states, Canada, Mexico, and the British Isles. Additional Freudian lullabies next Sunday. And for the next 2 weeks, they published these Freudian lullabies. And just to give you a sense, this one by Milton Dickstein, it's so knowledgeable about psychoanalysis that I actually looked him up. I thought maybe he was an early psychoanalyst, but he's not couldn't find him. He knows a lot more about psychoanalysis than I do, I think. What can I say? It starts, the lullaby starts with the mother singing to the baby about trees and birdies, and the baby says, "No, sing me the Epic of Freud." It rhymes in the original, but I forgot it. I think the joke is that young people are now all obsessed, including the babies, are all obsessed with Freud. And here you can just see, who's name checked: Breuer, Jones, Martin, Rivers, I think Riviere is who they meant, and then Hollingsworth to rhyme with controlling birth, and then Jeanette, mispronounced for the rhyme. It goes on and on and on. The joke being that, the tired mothers are trying to put the wakeful children to sleep, which is an old joke. This one is maybe, this one by William Sunners plays a different kind of game. It's kind of immigrant humor. Sleep, you chazer, don't you know? I want to see a movie show. If you sleep, I'll buy you toys, like you saw by Levy's Boys. So I guess one thing to say about this is that, like other Yiddish folkloristic cultural productions, it uses a kind of multilingual vocabulary that is, does particular kind of work. The fact that the insult is in Yiddish is no coincidence. Sleep, you chazer, don't you know? And it also, and here, if you want to be psychoanalytic about it, the way in which lullabies work is they have a gentle tone that covers over for that registers to the baby as parental love, but the lyrics actually express murderous rage. So the incredibly tired parent can get out some of their aggression while they're desperately trying to get the baby to sleep. Here you can, as many people have, you can map the aggression onto the Yiddish. It's the Yiddish that expresses the aggression. And we know from Freud's own case studies, the Rat Man, not in the published case study, but in the case notes, which didn't appear, which are the only case notes that were preserved, the Rat Man started every session by cursing Freud in Yiddish. And in the published case study, you don't even know he's Jewish. And in the case, and Freud very, very carefully wrote down all the Yiddish curses so Yiddish curses and Yiddish aggression played a part not only in the lullabies and the foreword, but also in Freud's own psychoanalytic life. Now, the foreword was sending a kind of complicated message here. Here's the second issue set of Freudian lullabies. And then on the left-hand side was the sort of thing that they said if it was the other way around, this could be the superego and that could be the id. So foreign accent to handicap, don't permit your child to acquire a foreign accent or intonation. Grammatical speech absolutely is essential. Eschew, how do you pronounce that word? Baby talk. Conversation at home, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the superego, become good Americans. And then there's the id in the Freudian lullaby, telling, speaking, this is the proper parent teaching their child good English. And on the other side is the, what? Is the chazers, is the Yiddish insult, which is, Freud talks about a Yiddish insult, I forget where it is, that he feels chamer. Okay, so what is going on here? Let's just take a step back and think about this. So in the 20s and 30s, you have this famous explosion of the Yiddish press. This is just many, Heint, I think, was the Warsaw Daily. What's his name? Avram Noverstern counts 54 Yiddish dailies that operated in different parts of the world between in the 20s and the 30s. So you have here an explosion of newspaper culture, and basically this is daily content. You have to get your readers to tune in every single day, and they basically had two, let's call them two basic, other than telling the news, there were two basic tasks of the Yiddish press, and one was to entertain. Obviously, the popular press a little bit more than the highbrow press. And the other was to educate or inculcate. And Freud was actually one of the few, if you draw a Venn diagram between the articles that entertain and the articles that educate, there's very little overlap. Freud is actually in this sweet spot where he's both entertaining, right? Like, he's funny, right? Obviously, they thought the Yiddish lullaby contest was a joke. He's funny, and he's as high culture as you can possibly be. And basically, the other thing he is that the Yiddish papers indulged in is he's a famous Jew. So famous Jews were the staples of the Yiddish press. And I don't just mean that if you read the Yiddish press, you'll see stories about famous Jews. They actually had lists of famous Jews. You know, you think it was just your bar mitzvah. So, so famous Jews, you know, if they could get two famous Jews at the same story, it was even better. So obviously, this is an old story. All the lists of famous Jews are just everywhere in the Jewish press. And it's always Freud and Einstein. And let me just say something. So Freud and Einstein happened to both be in Berlin. This is before they had their famous exchange about war. They happened to both be in Berlin visiting their sons. Christmas sometime in the 1920s, and someone said, oh, you know, you guys are the two most famous Jews, you should get together. And they did, they got together, and Freud recorded this in his diary. He said, I had a very pleasant afternoon with Albert Einstein. He understands as much about psychoanalysis as I do about the theory of relativity. So it was very nice. So, but, you know, Freud was being really disingenuous because there's no comparison. Like with Einstein, you get like the hair, theory of relativity, the bicycle, E equals MC2, and it's over. You know, it's like there's nothing really more to say if you're in the Yiddish press. Whereas Freud is like endlessly the gift that keeps on giving. This is just like one story that was in the New York Times week after week after week, where Samuel Goldwyn was trying to get Freud to write a Hollywood script. And he claimed this would be the greatest love story of all time. And this, I mean, it was like Samuel Goldwyn gets off the ship in, you know, wherever you get off the ship in Europe, and then Freud wouldn't even see him. So this was like, this is what I mean. Okay, and this is typical. Wer sind die berühmtesten Juden auf der Welt? Who are the most famous Jews in the world? Typically, this one is an unusual list because it actually has a woman on there. Who is it? Where is she? It's some movie star, I forget who. Anyway, you could see for yourself. Of course, it has Freud and Einstein. You don't have to say who they are. Elizabeth Bergner. Anyone know who that is? You know who she is? Anyway, not so famous anymore, unlike Freud and Einstein. So there were even debates about, there was an argument in the New York Times about between the novelist Ludwig Lewisohn gave his annual list of famous Jews to the New York Times, and he had the best, the really greatest geniuses and the, you know, less luminary stars, and Stephen Weiss, who was in the less luminary list, in his sermon, this actually made it to the New York Times, he said that people should not be allowed to be on most famous Jew list unless they're also good Jews. They can't just be good physicists. So this is the kind of thing that was all over the Jewish press. Okay, as I said, this was an international sport. And one of the things I was very interested to discover, I said I would talk a little bit about Buenos Aires and psychoanalysis. So this, I think, is like all this, there are very few things in the book that I think will change the history of psychoanalysis. Basically, these are very belated, marginal. I mean, they mean something to me, but they're not major findings about how psychoanalysis came to be. This, I think, was actually maybe only important to me, a kind of major finding about the history of psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires. So because I was finding all these Yiddish articles about psychoanalysis in the 20s in particular, this is just the founding of the newspaper. It's not the date of the newspaper. I think it's 1924. If you read any book about the history of psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires, they will tell you that psychoanalysis became a thing in Buenos Aires in the 30s. In 1931, there was the first reading group. In 1934, there was the first whatever. The history of psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires supposedly started in the 1930s. That's only if you're not a Yiddish speaker. Buenos Aires was crazy about psychoanalysis. The Yiddish press had, I think I counted like 20 articles about psychoanalysis in the Yiddish press in Buenos Aires. And my guess is, if I, could spend a lot more time researching this, you probably discover that these people who are the first reading group members, whatever, their parents are going to these lectures. These are because they were all Jewish children of immigrants. So this particular essay is just, you can see how long it is. This is not just a lullaby. This is a deep dive into psychoanalysis and the Unterbewusstsinnige, das Unterbewusstsinnige, which is not what eventually would become the standard term. There's the whole question of how you say the unconscious in Yiddish, which is funny because there's all these people who say that Yiddish is the unconscious of Jews. But how you say it, turns out we don't know how. So, und sein Roll in unser psychischen Leben. This is a detailed report on a lecture by Dr. Polina Rabinovich in somewhere in Buenos Aires sometime in the 1920s. And as I said, there's many similar stories like this in the Buenos Aires press. And I think this maybe takes me into a slight digression, which is the lecture. Because one of the ways, it's not just the newspaper by which people learned about psychoanalysis, it's also the public lecture, which was a form of entertainment, which you can't say is true anymore in our own time. Okay, so the greatest, most prolific lecturer about Freud and psychoanalysis, as far as I could determine, was somebody named Dr. Aleph Glicksman. And you can see here that this is from an advertisement of, in other words, the newspaper would advertise lecturers. You would put up your shingle, I can lecture on these topics. And what he could lecture on is Die Macht von Liebe und geistigen Leben. Oh, that's actually his Freud lecture. I forgot that. The Power of Love. That's a way to advertise Freud, huh? The Power of Love in Our Spiritual Life. Die Frau in her ewiger Sod, the woman and her eternal secret. You could see his specialty a bit, and there were others. And we're fortunate because we actually have a biographical sketch of Glicksman and his career as a lecturer from Melchravich, Mein Lexikon. Maybe some of you know Mein Lexikon is a kind of biographical encyclopedia of people who were killed in the Holocaust. And you think because they're killed in the Holocaust, Ravitch is going to say nice things about them. No, you haven't seen. That doesn't get you off scot-free in Ravitch's book. So this is, he obviously is a fabulous, maybe I'll just say a little bit about it so you're not reading. So what he says about Glicksman, and Glicksman was famous. He was known as I just said I was a graduate student. Glicksman was the eternal student. He came from a wealthy Hasidic family, and he went to Central Europe. His family sent him to Central Europe in 1901, where he accumulated degree after degree after degree. He had degrees in economics, philosophy, psychology. I may be forgetting. He wrote for The Economist. And in 1920, his family pulled the plug and said, okay, come home. And he realized that with all those degrees, he had no marketable skills at all, other than this. So he basically went around Poland giving lectures. And here's the description, Melech-Robich's description of one of his lectures. When the Freud fashion hit Jewish Poland, Dr. Glicksman's star ascended, with cities and towns begging him to grace them with a lecture about the great psychologist. Since Dr. Glicksman was even less capable of speaking to a general audience than of writing for one, his popularity began to wane until someone advised him to sprinkle a few jokes into his material. Glicksman heeded the advice and the invitations began to flow again. But in one shtetl, the audience found his jokes so side-splittingly hilarious that the convener had to pound on the table. You immature brats, wagon drivers, the professor is providing a serious lecture, and you laugh like impudent school children. The room grew somber as a funeral, and no one dared even smile at any of the jokes that followed. So I think one way of thinking about this is in a kind of chiastic structure with what's going on in Central Europe. So in Central Europe, buttoned up German Jews are paying a lot of money to say all the things that they won't otherwise say in polite company, if that's one way of reducing psychoanalysis to cliche or and in Eastern Europe, the exact opposite thing is happening, that Jews who basically consider psychoanalysis hilarious are being taught to treat it very seriously. So psychoanalysis had a sort of counter-function, you could say, in Eastern Europe. I'm almost at the end of this part of it. I'll just say this is, so the fascination with Freud, the interest in Freud just grew and grew and grew throughout the 1930s. Like at the end of the 1930s, Freud was often on the front page of the newspaper day after day after day after day, as for various reasons, including most importantly, his persecution in Vienna and the risk he was under. But there was also a kind of peak of Freud in every Jewish newspaper around his 80th birthday in 1936. And this was just on the same day. These two things were published on the same day. This is Sigmund Freud, der Schöpfer von Psychoanalyse, which is in the Groschen Bibliothek, number 271, for 30 Groschen. Boy, I would pay a lot more than that for one of these. I really, really coveted that. They're 54 pages, cheap print, often about, like Mata Hari was number one, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about with, this is like the penny things that you could buy directed at poor people with, the working class. And here on the right-hand side is the first installment of, I think it was 8 days in a row of lengthy expositions of Freud and psychoanalysis by Max Weinreich in the New York Daily Forward. And I think this just gives you a feeling in one article for how the Yiddish press saw Freud. So Professor Sigmund Freud, berühmter Forscher von geistigen Krankheiten, wird 80 Jahre alt. So professor is always called professor. The Yiddish press loved the word professor, which might explain something. The famous researcher of mental illness is turning 80 today, and I won't translate. I'll translate offhand. Psychoanalysis, the way to heal nervous ailments that Professor Freud discovered, number one. 2, the difficulty that Freud underwent to lieb sein Yiddishkeit, because he was a Jew. Always number 2, right? So this is the 30s. So I'll just say that people talk about Freud's Jewishness as a kind of obstacle to the acceptance of psychoanalysis as a science. It did not work that way in the Jewish press. If anything, Freud's persecution by anti-Semites was a way for Jews to overcome any resistance they might have to psychoanalysis. Sure, infantile sexuality, give it to me, right? He's, okay, was ist das Einzige, what is a nervous ailment? The curious case of a young girl who had such an ailment and how she was healed through hypnotism. So hypnotism was already like long not the practice in psychoanalysis, but in the Yiddish press, it was like a curious thing that people enjoyed hearing about. And then this is another crazy thing about this. So maybe you don't know that the Yiddish, this is supposedly nominally a socialist paper, but very culturally conservative, like a lot of the Jewish press. And here you have a note from the editor, and it basically says, you should not take this article as an endorsement of psychoanalysis. We've heard stories about it. Apparently, Jewish women lie down on a couch and talk every day for 6 months. Nervous women, I think he says, not Jewish women, nervous women, can relate to both those things, talk for 6 months. And 6 months, I was like, halavai, right? If only it were 6 months. And this is supposed to cure them. But we respect Max Weinreich, the founder of the esteemed YIVO Institute, and we have decided to give him space in our pages to explain to us why we should care about psychoanalysis. So that's a kind of, and here is the letter that Freud wrote as an introduction to Max Weinreich's 3-volume translation of Freud's Introductory Lectures of Psychoanalysis. I think I'm just going to run through it, and you'll see Freud's connection to the world of Yiddish, to the high cultural world of Yiddish, was extremely precious to anyone involved. YIVO still has this honorary board of trustees on its website today, where you can see Einstein and Freud were part of the honorary board. And lest you think, I'm trying to remember why I put the slide in, but I think what I was trying to say is, lest you think that psychoanalysis is the worldly, universal, cosmopolitan science, and its Yiddish-speaking offshoot was parochial. You should know that there were branches of YIVO around the world. There you see the 30 branches in the entrance hall of YIVO. And it was also cosmopolitan in the sense that the psychoanalytic research being done at YIVO also took into account things like race theory, and there's a picture of the Tuskegee Institute. Okay, so I'm just gonna, my last 2 slides, I'll just talk about the very end of Freud's career in the Yiddish press, which in the late 1930s, there was a real obsession with his safety, to the point where the Yiddish editors had to say, there's other Jews in Vienna besides Freud. He somehow stood in for, look, even Freud is under threat. And one of the journalists, also a poet, who went to visit him, describes, this is Yud Lamed Teller, also wrote in English under the name Judd Teller. He describes visiting the Jewish community in Vienna, and let's just say there's a lot of projection, I think is the technical term in this. I mean, he takes note of the fact he visits Freud and he visits Hasidic courts. Maybe you don't know that there were quite a few Hasidic courts in Vienna in the interwar period. And he writes a little bit about his experience visiting Freud. But then he gets home and he writes a long poetry cycle about Freud and psychoanalysis in Yiddish, which is dedicated to Freud on his 82nd birthday. And here's a little piece of his, he also said, I'll just say one more thing when I talk about him as being projecting. He somehow missaw Freud's, we know very well what Freud's house looked like, including photographs done before Freud left. And Teller seems to remember images of Freud's, photographs of Freud's ancestors or portraits of Freud's religious ancestors. This is clearly some kind of psychic projection. And here he's really, his interest in Freud's Jewish ancestors is evident also in this poem. He describes Freud as basically speaking Yiddish in his mind when he sees the Nazi youth on the street. He calls them, the last line of this segment, Oral Esav Goy. These are the words his ancestors chewed. These are all impolite, let's say, what Weinreich calls differentiation language, these ways in which Jews talk about non-Jews. And Freud belonged to the world, let's say, very obviously. These Jewish journalists that came to see him were not, on the top of the list of his famous disciples, and yet they felt that the way they pictured it is that in Freud's own mind, in the privacy of it, he had a particular connection to his Yiddish speakers, that he also was speaking Yiddish, that when he looked at Nazis, he was hearing the old Yiddish ways to describe non-Jews that his ancestors had chewed over. So this fascination with Freud's background, this curiosity about his background, full of myths and etc. Oh, here's, this is a family tree in which Freud, we don't really care about most of these people, but there's Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud, and there you discover, this is widely reproduced and is also in the town, the Yiskarbuch of the town of Buchach, where Freud's ancestors came from, and where my father was born. But, and Yisachar and Freda, you discover that Freud's last name is actually a Jewish matronym, that he had a great-great-grandmother named Freda. And I think this is a kind of precious thing for a lot of the Yiddish readers. And here, even his far-flung relatives are of interest. So this is from the forward in the late 30s. Professor Freud had the Plemenitza in Hunter College. He learns the psychologia. So he has a niece. I could not discover I spent a lot of time poring over the family tree, trying to figure out who this is. She's interviewed just because she's the niece of Freud. She's studying psychology, and she says, I don't agree with everything that my uncle says, but she's generous. I still think, he has some very good ideas, I think is what she says. I think you could sort of get the tone. Her name is Shirley something. Okay, so this is my last slide. I'll just say that to me, the story of the Jewish press and its fascination with Freud and its attempt to create connections with Freud and its fascination in particular with his being the victim of anti-Semitism and what his fate was in the late 1930s, all of this was at fever pitch at the end of Freud's life. At the very time, if you want to ask me about how they felt about Moses and monotheism, I can tell you that too. That's, there is a hint, the archives yield at least some evidence that this wasn't entirely unreciprocated, that Freud himself had his share of projection, that Freud felt something for these people who wanted to make this Jewish connection with him too. And this is the story of, so I.N. Steinberg, who's a really fascinating character, a Hasidic, anarchist, territorialist, YIVO activist, who was and this particular meeting we know took place. There were 3 YIVO representatives who visited Freud at the very end of his life. They all wrote about it, so we have multiple stories about it. And Steinberg talks about going to visit him and says, I told him briefly about the scientific work being carried out at YIVO, and he expressed his sorrow at not knowing the 2 languages, Hebrew and Yiddish, which made it impossible to follow what was happening in the Jewish branch of the science. Like, let's just pause for a second. If Steinberg is quoting Freud correctly, then Freud believed that there was a Jewish branch to psychoanalysis. and that Jewish branch was headquartered at YIVO. And the fact that there was so this whole body of literature, this whole mountains of literature on is psychoanalysis a Jewish science, fails to mention that Freud thought that there was a Jewish psychoanalysis. It was just a little bit further to the east. What? But it's a science? Science. He said it was science. Actually, the way the conversation started, I didn't want to put the whole story on there, even though it's fascinating, is that Freud, every time anyone remotely Jewish walked into his house in 1938 or 1939, he would say, "Do you hate me because I wrote Moses and Monotheism?" And Steinberg gave him a really satisfactory answer. He said, "Chas v'shalom, God forbid, you have to," and then he quotes some Talmudic, I'm sure, you'll be able to guess what it is, Daniel, some Talmudic dictum that says, you may never not tell the truth because of the exigencies of the time or something like that. You must speak the truth. And Moses was an Egyptian or whatever. So Steinberg gave, in other words, Freud, if you want to talk about the complicated sort of games that Jews play with each other. So one of those complicated games is that a less Jewy Jew, if you want to use the technical term, like Freud, would need some kind of validation from the more Jewy Jew, right? The professors of Jewish studies and the bearded, whatever, Hasidim. And Steinberg was very happy to give him that validation. So that happened. And then he says, I'm sorry I can't learn it. I want to help YIVO. And then, although I haven't reached the level of the Jews of Eastern Europe, I am still a Jew, a godless Jew. I look in your faces and see strong vestiges of my dead father. I don't know how to explain it, but there is a great commonality in our blood. So after basically 2 decades of Jews scrutinizing Freud's face to see how Jewish he looked and figuring out whether his ancestors were from this shtetl or another, we see that Freud was capable of playing that same game. If you want to talk about it as a kind of uncanny, there's Freud's father. He looked at a younger man and saw his older father at the very end of his life. So I thought that was a good way to bring this lecture full circle. Thank you. Sorry, I went on too long, I'm sure. No. Where should I stay?
Where do you want?
Should I sit there or here?
Yeah, here. I like that you know the answer. I just guessed the answer. Yeah, so the plan for now is that we're gonna, I'm gonna just ask a couple questions, and then Yael will ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it for conversation. I'll just, I realize I never introduced myself. My name is Roni Masel. I teach in comparative literature, and I'm affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies. And Yael Segalovitz here is a visiting professor here in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Helen Diller Institute, and whose book that's right there we celebrated just about a month ago. So congrats on that too. Okay, so I want to highlight just 2 points among many that stayed with me after reading this book, this incredible book, and I promise to at least try to turn them into questions. So first, the book pays close attention to various kinds of Freud-related artifacts, as we saw today. And this was, of course, reflected today in the presentation or in the exhibition. And the interesting lives of these Freud text translations, which you approach as not only text, but also printed books, objects, moving in between human hands as commodity or as carriers of social relations, as maybe historians of the book would say. And in the book, you also discuss the many Freud tchotchkes and memorabilia you had involuntarily accumulated while working on the book, from T-shirts and mugs to and magnets to these little icons constituting a certain some kind of a personal Freud altar in the age of mass production and consumerist late capitalism. You follow Rita Felsky's adaptation of Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which pays attention to how objects do things in our world, how they act as agents while being inanimate objects. And this attention brings you to reflect on how so much of the scholarship which is devoted to proving Freud's Jewishness, or in Derrida's words that you quote in the book, to performing a second bris, a second circumcision on this dead man. So how this body of scholarship constantly and perhaps uncritically gravitated towards the Jewish objects in Freud's life, reconstructing the material life of an objecthood of Freud's Jewishness, from Kiddush cups to photographs, letters, dedications in the Hebrew alphabet, to never-used prayer books. So it seems that an argument that this aspect of the book is promoting is a rethinking of Jewishness not as an epistemological thing, neither identity nor a form of identification as a post-structuralist would maybe have it, not a religion, not an essence, not a race nor ethnicity, but something related to objecthood, to things. In this, your book stands in an interesting conversation with several other books that came out in recent years that think the Jewish experience through material objects, and I'm thinking here of Barbara Mann's recent book and Laura Levitt, among others. So more broadly, this aspect of the book and of your presentation today stands in conversation with material approaches to literature or to intellectual history, and I'm thinking of, in this case, on Leah Price or Rita Felsky that I mentioned before, perhaps object-oriented ontology or whatever is called thing theory, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the fascinating aspects of this theme in the book is how your attention to objects, material objects, a critical attention as well as a personal one, also mirrors or doubles a similar kind of duality in Freud, who likewise possessed both a strong attachment to objects and artifacts, and developed theoretical approaches to objecthood, most critically and interestingly in the context of the fetish. So this is not so much a question as it is a curiosity and a request that you expand a bit on your approach to Freud's things, or maybe alternately to Freud's approach to things, or how any of these two offer interventions into how we can rethink Jewishness, literature, or psychoanalysis through and with things, objects. So if you'll allow me to turn a phrase, I'll ask, what does a Freudian inflected tchotchke theory look like for you, or thing theory? Okay, this is one question about objects. And secondly, your book boldly suggests surface reading of the ultimate deep or symptomatic reader, right? Freud. If Freud is, Naomi is telling us, if Freud is telling us he's Jewish, then he's Jewish. So why think that his Jewishness is something that needs to be uncovered? Why would we presume that it is hidden? So what I find even more fascinating is that as you tie this approach together with the question of Freud's supposedly hidden Jewishness, you also offer to us another genealogy for the metaphor of depth, hiddenness, or concealment of text that was charted in Stephen Bess and Sharon Marcus's influential call for surface reading. In this alternative genealogy, you locate the desire for depth and the infatuation with concealed truths, not in a trajectory from Augustine to Marx and Freud, but in the early modern world's obsession with the figure of the converso, or the crypto-Jew. So the phrase hermeneutics of suspicion, coined by Paul Ricoeur to describe this interpretive practice of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, catches very well, in other words, the Inquisition's conceptualization of truth, right? Of truth, of being, of interpretation, where the truth of Jewishness is always suspected or presumed to be hidden, and can and must therefore be revealed and unearthed through an act of aggression, which would be the interpretive act. So the Enlightenment's religious tolerance, however, did not rid itself of these desires and conceptions of truth as hidden, as in the figure of the crypto-Jew, rather, in fact, fed them while never admitting to doing so, presenting a vision of universalism uninterrupted by particularist sensibilities, beliefs, modes of belonging, desire, etc., thereby adding another layer of concealment of a particularist intolerance under the guise of universalism. And so that this genealogy of depth or hiddenness or concealment of truth that you offer for us in this book is one which is also an effect of or a response to the Enlightenment. The desire to prove Freud's Jewishness, which is prevalent in the scholarship on the Jewish Freud, is also a decision to join in a Foucauldian or a post-colonial critique of the Enlightenment, to unearth the hidden particularism buried under the veneer of universal tolerance. At the same time, it is also a response to the Jewish Enlightenment, as you write in the book, which famously advocated a dual mode of a Jew at home and a man on the street. And so when figures like Karl Kraus, with whom we started, when they joke about assimilated Jews as suffering from different kinds of diseases from traditional Jews, such jokes are also gestures towards the Enlightenment and its failures and its modes of constructing or hiding truth, demanding an interpretation of a different kind. And the same goes for this both desire and anxiety about bageling, these lists of famous Jews, this incessant sort of preoccupation with identifying Jews everywhere in the world and locating them on maps and on lists. So here's my question. If both the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment, its post-assimilation rejection, and its Foucauldian and post-colonial critique are all modeled on an understanding of truth as deeply concealed, of Jewishness as a hidden secret. Oh, the light is helpful. Thank you. If they're all modeled on this assumption of truth as hidden, and of interpretation as the pleasurable or violent act of unmasking the crypto-Jew, what relationship to the Enlightenment does surface reading maintain? This is my question. And what relationship can surface reading cultivate to this great anti-hero or boogeyman of the early modern world, the crypto-Jew? Right, so is there an avenue here, a prospect for us in a surface reading to establish a different kind of relationship to the Enlightenment, right? So at a time that fascist forms of particularism dominate our imagination globally and here, in an anti-humanist and anti-Enlightenment populism, do you think that that surface reading that the book performs offers a relationship of a different kind to the Enlightenment, one which isn't ignorant of its necessary critique, but isn't ready to throw it out the window either? And I'm asking all of this because I think that chapter 4 in the book that is titled The Jewish Freud in the Age of Black Lives Matter, which was written in 2020, and appears in the book, makes fascinating moves in that direction and thinking about how to think that problematic of the crypto-Jew, that problematic of revealing supposedly hidden but actually apparent truths about thinking Jewishness and race. So I think that chapter does that, and I'm just very curious to hear kind of the current version of, or your current take on that. So now Yael Segalovitz, and then we'll add more questions from the audience.
Okay, so when Roni said that we should both, respond to Naomi's book, I said, who would want to listen to anyone else after Naomi Seidman speaks, and you totally understand. So I'll try to be short and stick to the 5 minutes that we kind of set for ourselves. And I want to start in the spirit of Naomi's book with coming out of my own Seidman's closet and admit that I am in love with Naomi Seidman's thinking. On a concretely affective level, there is something intellectually infatuating in her writing and thinking. And I vividly remember myself as a graduate student or a gradually studying person when I heard Naomi's talk, and I don't recall what she was talking about, but I do remember my experience, which was literally that my mind was blowing up. I was full to the brim with new ideas and connections and associations that I couldn't wait to put down on paper, which I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing right now. Her witty, acutely smart, provocative work with ideas, putting them together in an unexpected, even I would say iconoclastic formulations, allowing contradictions to emerge and to be played with, is deeply generative, setting in motion creative processes in her readers, and in that sense, I think also deeply generous. And we can see all of that in translating the Jewish Freud. I mean, who would have thought that George Floyd, Jacques Derrida, and Chaim Nachman Bialik could somehow gather under one roof and have something interesting to say to one another? And this richness felt very palpable when I tried to describe to my students the book, and some of them are here so they can say that I'm right when I said, it's a book about Freud's work in Hebrew and Yiddish. Actually, it's a book about surface reading and affect theory. It's also a book about the politics of translation, and it's also a book about race and Jewish identity. And in some way, it's all true. But Naomi also theorizes in the book her own interpretative style, what underlies her epistemology. And I quote her when she says, rather than hidden depth, the object of my study is surfaces, affects, and touch. Surfaces that hold material objects marked as Jewish, affects that reverse these objects, and the touch that brings them together. And in doing so, Seidman tells us that she's building on Eve Kosovsky's Sedgwick famous manifesto for apparative reading. And in that move, she actually, in another kind of sleight of hand, reads Freud in a surface affective reading via Sedgwick, who herself considers Freud the forefather and master of the opposite, right, of depth, symptomatic, archaeological, paranoid reading. So Naomi once again kind of pushes or presents the whole method war conversation on its head. And when I was reading this book, I had once again this Seidman effect. And I thought to myself, how did she know that I've been spending the last few months writing and thinking about Freud's own surface affective reading method? So Naomi knows it all, if you guys are, wondering. And the number of thoughts and examples that came pouring into my head was really astounding. So I'll just let you, in the 2 minutes that I have, kind of an example of the kind of thought that this generated in me. Freud's first extensive reading of literature, some would say his best, is in his 1907 Delusion and Dreams in Jensen Gradova, where he offers a detailed reading of Wilhelm Jensen's novella from 1903, Gradova and Pompeian Fantasy. And the novella follows a young archaeologist, Norbert Henold, who finds himself gripped by an all-consuming fixation and fascination with an ancient Roman bas-relief that depicts a young woman with a distinctive walking gait. And he calls her Gradova. And this obsession drives Norbert to Pompeii, where he becomes convinced that he is, in fact, finding this person, Gradova, who has remained alive as a ghost since the city's 79 CE destruction. And he imagines that he meets this ghost every day, and he has, deep conversations with her. But as the narrative unfolds, the ghost gradually reveals herself, both to Norbert and to the readers, only by the end of the novella, as Zoe Bergtgang. So that is Norbert's neighbor and intimate childhood friend that he has forgotten, right? Freud will say repressed along with sexual desires. And she has sought his companionship for years, but for no avail. Zoe, in the end, is the one that repairs or cures Norbert through these ghostly encounters. And we would imagine then that Freud, in his reading, would kind of align himself with the archaeologist, right, with Norbert, because that is what he does. He, Freud also, through this essay, formulates the basic idea of the mind as an archaeological formation that you have to dig to find repressed materials. But also, we would imagine this is where he, develops archaeological reading or paranoid reading. But in fact, the figure that he most aligns himself, Freud, is the ghost, is Zoe. He says, she is the reader. She is the ideal therapist. And I won't get into details, but I really think Freud is conducting through his, fascination with the ghost a kind of surface reading in this text. So Naomi, I'm asking you, since you know it all, what can we say about Freud as a surface reader? I mean, are we reading him against the grain, or is it really there? And you also say that in your engagement with surface and depth reading, you found that they're actually not so opposite as complementary. So I was wondering, I can read you your quote if you want, how that happens. And lastly, why in the current, conversation in the humanities, we see such an insistence, Sedgwick and Bast and Marcus, to position Freud firmly on the side of the suspicious, paranoid, archaeological reader. What intellectual or disciplinary purposes does this strict or rigid categorization serve? But most of all, thank you.
Well, now what happens?
You answer all our questions.
I answer the questions, or do we open it up?
To be honest, that's up to you. Do you want to collect?
Maybe I'll just say, I'm wondering if people follow what the argument we're having or what the discussion is, and so the first 3 chapters of the book. I gave the fourth. This is the 5th chapter of the book, which is the most, I think, easy to just say without looking at notes. It doesn't make a complicated theoretical argument. But the first 3 chapters of the book make a somewhat complicated theoretical argument, which I then try to apply to what seemed like the big issue, which was Black Lives Matter. And the argument is that the question I was working with is why is it that Freud's theory of what's sometimes called a topological, and now I'm forgetting what it's called, topographical model of the psyche, why does it seem to map so nicely onto conceptions of Jewish difference and modernity, so including in very specific ways around Jewish languages, with the European languages being the upper surface level, and then the Jewish languages being somehow below, or the id as yid is a quick way of explaining what it is that I'm dealing with, which is an old joke that actually goes back to Jones, Ernest Jones. So it's not something some Jewish studies scholar thought of, that the id is the yid, and that there seems to be an ideology of Jewishness that, maybe goes back to the Inquisition and the attempt to uncover the secret Jew, that somehow maps very kind of nicely onto the notion of the psyche as a stratified, layered phenomenon. And how do we think about this? Is it just a weird coincidence? And so I kind of play with that for the first 2 chapters, and then I, in some ways, reject, and then the question is rightfully or not, reread Freud's topographical model and the basically through the critique of converso identity. So converso identity is now often seen as a kind of myth, a desire. It's like all these people who want to discover some secret Jewishness. It's almost as if the opposite is the case. There isn't a European who's holding on to a secret Jew, but basically a modern person who's imagining that they have some deep connection to Jewishness. It's as if the aggressive move of trying to discover the Jew is actually a wishful thinking, that there is some deep. I think Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about conversos, backward conversos or upside down conversos, people who have, who wear like the biggest Star of David that you could possibly find, but it has like no Jewish content at all. It's just sheer performance, which gets us to, Jewish activism, I guess. And then the 3rd chapter is, notices that all of this depends on kind of reading Freud as an archaeologist, and there's been a kind of move among scholars to say, he wasn't an archaeologist. Other people were doing the digging. He was a collector. So what happens if we read all these phenomena as forms of collection, as forms of signaling, as, I think of as on the surface, these kinds of, without assuming. I mean, part of the reason why I was trying to avoid the kind of let us discover the hidden Freud is because Derrida already said, as you said, it's a totally aggressive move, and it also does the work of making the person who knows the Jewish languages appear to have a certain kind of power over the one who doesn't, right? So it's the Jewish studies professor who can tell you that Proust was really more Jewish than he was willing to admit. Or, it's a certain kind of game that Lacan already said, the psychoanalyst is in the subject, that puts, the psychoanalyst is the subject supposed to know, or assumed to know, I forget the exact formulation. And what if nobody knows? What if none of us are, we're not playing the game of I know, you know. I know this doesn't answer the question of whether Freud does this, but in terms of him being a surface, people always assume that all he did was psychoanalyze people, which is easy to believe. But if you read the work, if you read his own notes, you see somebody comes to him and they, are having problems getting an erection, the sort of thing you come to Freud for. And he says, you look kind of hungry. And here's 30 francs and go get a steak around the corner. And if you still have a problem tonight, let me know. So, nobody thinks of Freud in this way. And he's been turned in a caricatured way. He's turned into a kind of, and what this means is that when he says something that just happens to be true, we're incapable of hearing it because of this aggressive and again, wish-fulfilling idea that we're going to be the ones who discover something about Freud. I realize that my two mics are in static with each other. Maybe I'll just say another sentence about the Black Lives Matter. Boy, do not try to write a book that is topical. Because what I was saying about Black Lives Matter, it's interesting, Dina's gone, but Dina and I were talking about how during Black Lives Matter, Jews were basically supposed to cop to being white. I mean, that was a big part of what was going on in the activist community. Remember that? When you don't check the box that says other when you're white. Being white is, and let's point out that white here means a total surface reading of what Ashkenazic Jews, a surface reading of what you look like to a cop. That's what Jews were copping to. We look white to cops. And because we look white to cops, and then my question is if this is the game that we're playing now, that we look white and there's nothing hidden, then, have we just, the fact that we all, I shouldn't speak for other people, that I have the faintest desire to write, yeah, but I'm also Ashkenazi Jewish and I grew up ultra-Orthodox, all these buts, all of that creates a new form of hidden Jewishness. Where we are now, in terms of, the new situation and what I would be writing if I were to write this book now, I would love to sit and work out with you. I don't feel like I'm capable of doing it at the moment. I don't know what is going to make it capable of doing it, but I was basically, and one of I guess the other thing I was coming up with in that period was that there was just that one of the reasons to kind of reject a certain sort of post-colonial view of Jewishness was that this insistence on the Jew as other and a certain kind of, let's call it, habit of thought, which is to say that Jewish racism was basically a product of assimilation, so that the real racists, the Zionists in some formulations, are basically imitating European nationalism. In Yiddish circles, it was like, the real Jews aren't racist. It's the ones who assimilate who become racist. And I felt as if there was something that needed to happen with a certain kind of coming to terms with the capacity of Yiddish or Jewishness to be racist on its own, without the old model of we just get everything bad from Protestantism or whatever that all is. I don't know if that's at all coherent, and how that fits in with your brilliant question. Thank you for that, really, and you too. And I knew you were writing about this. You were the one who gave me the idea of reading. I mean, you're cited. How do you not know that? I mean, I hope I cited you. you're like, I was like, yes, yes. But I said, there are people who are doing a surface reading of Freud, right? And it was basically you I meant by people.
All right, let's.
Sorry that we're not giving anyone else a chance to talk.
I'm all in favor of surface reading, I suppose, particularly when it's a symptomatic surface reading and the symptoms are all over the place on the surface. But, you know, when Freud writes Little Hans or the Rat Man, and in the case of the Rat Man, we actually have the notes, you know, of how much Jewishness, Yiddishkeit was involved in the encounter, and then erases that completely. I mean, I didn't write about the Rat Man, but I wrote about Little Hans, as if he was some little Aryan boy, you know. There is something going on. And the question is, what is going on? In other words, what is Freud hiding? What is he repressing? And it's too easy to say he just was worried about psychoanalysis being labeled a Jewish science. So there is something that is hidden right on the surface.
Right.
I mean, it's hidden in plain sight. So to speak, which has been my project of reading for my entire life, looking for things that are hidden in plain sight. So
Little Hans is a major character in my book too,
yeah.
for surface reasons, as you say. So Little Hans, Freud says, you know, Little Hans's father says to him, should we baptize our child? I think he's not circumcised, if I remember correctly. And Freud says, you can, but it's not going to help. If you let him grow up Jewish, then he'll have weapons at his disposal to deal with anti-Semitism. Freud says this directly. He basically, this is a summary of, and Max Weinreich, who takes as his main example, this is what I mean by on the surface, this is a surface reading. Max Weinreich's main example of the unconscious transmission of Jewishness is through animal phobias. He says, if you want to know how Jewish someone is, don't ask them if they speak Yiddish, ask them if they're afraid of dogs. Right. So, and basically Freud, you know, he looks at Little Hans, and he looks at children. He says the problem with Jewish life today is that we don't have the compensatory mechanisms to deal with anti-Semitism just when it's rising, because people are becoming secular. He basically believed all of Jewish religion was a compensatory mechanism to deal with anti-Semitism, Jewish superiority and Jewish narcissism. He said, in a crazy meta moment, he says, if you want to understand how Jews deal with anti-Semitism, read lists of famous Jews. So basically, he uses lists of famous Jews, and then he doesn't mention Freud, because it would have been just like Freud doesn't mention that Little Hans was. He doesn't mention Freud because it would be embarrassing for him to talk about his own association with a famous Jew. But he basically believed that famous Jews were a compensatory mechanism of the same kind that Freud was talking about. In other words, you don't need the Oedipal complex, which is what Freud thought. That you can look at the surface of people's understanding of what Jewishness is to understand animal phobias as a form of the unconscious transmission of Jewishness. Have I disagreed with you, or just what?
But it's worth continuing.
Yes, sorry, that was right. Yeah, my ninth chapter is called Jews, Dogs, and Other Animals.
Hi. So I'm curious why at the Yiddish Book Center, where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of Das Kapital, probably the book most frequently donated, so most often purchased, and used, you know, not shelf-worn, there's a paucity of Freud. When he began, folks began translating him in the early 20th century, pre-war, when there were significant Jewish presses in Europe and in the United States. Why aren't those books on the shelves?
Have you tried reading them? No.
In English a little, yes.
So I had a copy of this book was sent to me by Itzik Gottesman, who, is he related to you? No. Through marriage. It sat in, the bungalow, the Catskills bungalow of his family for, whatever, 60, 70, 80, 90 years. And it was, that edition had the pages that were uncut. It was like cut until page 15, and then the rest were uncut. I mean, Freud was of great interest as popularized and summarized. The actual, I mean, this was the most famous, this was the most popular of the Freud books, and the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which is, I think, really readable, but it wasn't translated into Yiddish. And I think the idea that these would be, I mean, A Future of an Illusion was translated too. That might have been a little bit more popular. The other thing is Das Kapital was really, I mean, it was given as a gift if you joined whatever party or you got a, I mean, it was like a it was like a socialist bar mitzvah book. What?
Even if you showed up once.
If you showed up once, right, you got it. It must have been, if there's so many copies, I can't believe it wasn't like given as a premium with some subscription to, I almost said prescription. Think about talking about Freud, it's like all these Freudian slips come out of your mouth. That's my guess, but it's a great question.
It's not an easy book either.
No, but it's different. You signal something by owning it. You don't have to read it. You sleep with it under your pillow. And then next thing you know, there's a revolution. Okay, are there more?
Any more questions?
Complaints.
Do you know, did Freud actually really believe that Moses was an Egyptian?
Did Freud believe that Moses was an Egyptian? I don't know. I think he did because he wrote it, and I'm a surface theorist. But maybe I can answer the question of what the Jewish press thought of Moses' monotheism. Actually, let me just ask you what you think they thought. Guess. So Freud wrote all over, Moses and monotheism. He was so worried that the Jewish community was going to hate it, and how could he attack them at this moment? And the Jewish press, which had spent the previous 15 years trying to establish that Freud knew some Hebrew and whatever, was united that Freud knew no Hebrew at all after they read Moses and monotheism. And no one was even slightly threatened by Moses and monotheism. They were just united in their scorn for it. That Moses was an Egyptian because he had an Egyptian name. What does that say about Sigmund Freud, right? They're like, it's just one joke after another. The Jewish press was delighted that Freud had made some attempt to step foot on their turf. And it's laughable that Freud thought that any Jew would feel threatened by Moses and monotheism. There has been no Jew that was threatened by Moses and monotheism ever that I have found. So it was Freud who was totally neurotic about it. I already said it was like, this crazy attempt to get validation from some actual Jew, a Jewish professor, a Hebrew professor. So yeah, that was the game that was played with Moses and monotheism. The kindest things that people said about it were, even the Orthodox press got involved in that. The kindest things they said was, look, he's coming home. He's doing Midrash. He's a Jew. He really is a Jew. Okay, he doesn't know Hebrew, but he tried.
Since you mentioned Freud's name, I have a surface level question, which is, you talked in the middle of the talk about this guy Glicksmann, who's going around giving lectures on Freud, but you mentioned he had a whole bunch of degrees in different topics. I'm wondering, do you think What exactly was it about Freud that attracted him, if we know anything about him? And could it have been the superficial connection of Glixman, the name, and Freud, the name?
Oh, beautiful. Glixman was a serious, he studied psychology. I think, so one of the things that I try to figure out in my book is, if you could say there's like the maximalist the question of how Jewish psychoanalysis is and how Jewish Freud is, has kind of maximalist and minimalist answers. And I tried to, and in the 90s, let's say we were at a maximalist moment. And the maximalism, I wanted to know where it started. Like, who is it that started playing these Jewish games with Freud? If we just want to call them Jewish games, like not to get into them, they were correct or whatever. It was Glixman. And it was a total accident. It was completely by virtue of him trying to write about Freud in Yiddish that he discovered, for instance, that the best translation for trieb that he could find was Yetzer. Suddenly you're in rabbinic territory. So, and you could see, because he writes 6 different essays about Freud, and the first 2 he's comparing Freud to Spinoza and to Ibsen and Shakespeare, and then he's like, but how do you? And then he's like, now I'm going to see how you apply Freud to Judaism, and suddenly we're like deep in Kabbalistic territory, and he starts off directing Freud toward Jewish topics. Like he says, Freud can explain like a Rashi in Genesis, and then the next thing you know, it's just Freud has become a Jewish thinker. And it's almost like the language did it. And it's Glixman, and then and that's in 1924 maybe, and we haven't stopped playing that game.
So anyone looking for validation from a Jewish professor is welcome to approach. Thank you.
Validate everybody's parking.
Right. Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Noam.